Hello Fleet, and welcome back to another episode of Know Your Ship with me, Chase. Before I get to today's episode, however, I just wanted to wish you all a very happy 2015. Also, the winners of the Christmas presents have all been contacted via email. So anyways, getting back on track with this particular episode. Today's episode will be on the U.S. aircraft carrier the Langley. She will be the first U.S. aircraft carrier to appear in World of Warships, appearing at Tier 4. The Langley spent the majority of her time as the ship where pilots and admirals learned about carrier operations. By the time World War II rolled around, she had been surpassed in size by the two Lexington-class carriers, as well as the three ships of the Yorktown class. The two Lexington-class ships dwarfs the Langley, as can be seen in this particular image. The Langley was relegated primarily to the roles of a seaplane tender, and in 1942, while delivering 32 P-40 fighters, she came under attack from the Japanese 21st and 23rd Naval Air Flotillas. She was hit 5 times with the immediate loss of 16 crew members, and her crew was subsequently forced to abandon ship, and the escorting destroyer scuttled her to prevent her from falling into enemy hands. A large number of her crew would be subsequently lost on the USS Pecos as it was transporting her survivors to Australia. Today's episode will be on the Langley service as an aircraft carrier, so sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode.
The close relations between the U.S. and British navies and the free interchange of ideas relating to carriers led to renewed American interest in naval aviation.
We have observers in Europe. We watch as they develop this thing. Also, we have British officers attached to the U.S. Navy, and they tell us how they're going to do it. So by the end of World War I, the U.S. Navy is interested in aircraft carriers also, and is talking about building one.
The big show was the bombing of the battleship Ostfriesland. After a second low-altitude attack with 7 2,000-pound bombs, Ostfriesland went down. And Army General Billy Mitchell, who led this attack, almost convinced America that surface ships were obsolete. We didn't agree. It wasn't a question of whether planes could sink an anchored and undefended vessel. They'd done that. But what struck us was the promise and the idea of using planes to defend these ships and extend sea power. Rear Admiral William Moffett believed wholeheartedly in the idea. Moffett took the Navy's case to President Coolidge. He named a number of prominent civilians, the Morrow Board, headed by Dwight Morrow, to determine basic aviation policy for all our military services. So, in this somewhat skeptical atmosphere, the USS Langley CV-1 emerged. She was an experiment at first, a flight deck built on an obsolete collier's hull, an airport sent out to sea. Lieutenant Commander Chevalier made the first landing on the Langley deck in 1922. For the next few years, Navy pilots and the Langley crew worked hard to master the complex techniques for handling both the carrier and her planes. But we learned to land on her deck. We also worked hard at learning to take off, and at air navigation, gunfire spotting, and aerial gunnery. The early 1920s also saw the development of catapults, arresting gear, a faster elevator to clear the flight deck, safe fuel handling techniques, a landing light system, and all the other hardware needed to launch and land, to refuel and maintain aircraft at sea. All our early work was complicated by the progress made in aircraft design from 1925 to 1930. Engines were increasingly bigger and more powerful. Planes got heavier and yet flew higher, farther, faster almost every day. Speed and range of our planes increased, the original mission of naval aircraft as fighters and scouts and gunfire observers for the fleet began to shift. Pilots began to experiment with different methods of bombing. We dropped everything, even delicate submarine torpedoes, in a continuing search for new methods of attack and defense. All this while, we were doing more than learning the mechanical and flight techniques of operating the carrier and its planes. We were also developing carrier doctrine, the theory of how the naval air arm should operate, including some new ideas of the strategy, the maneuvers that carrier-supported fleet might use in war. Not everyone always understood the big changes underway. In 1926, the Morrow Board had refused the Navy a separate air arm. This was a disappointment to men like Admiral Moffett, who even then foresaw war in the Pacific and the role of naval air and carriers in that war. But Moffett took it gracefully, I thought. Hell, he said, we won't secede from the Navy over this. We'll take it over.
In 1922, the U.S. Navy commissioned its first aircraft carrier, the experimental USS Langley. Converted from a naval coal carrier, she displaced 13,000 tons and had a top speed of 14 knots. A 534-foot wooden plank flight deck, running virtually the length of the ship, was mounted by a complex system of girders and trusses on top of the modified superstructure. But the most important advances made by the Langley had nothing to do with the design of the ship. They lay instead with the development of flight deck operating procedures. These included the introduction of the LSO, or Landing Signal Officer, who used flag signals to help guide the plane to a safe landing. A system called the Arrestor Gear was also devised. This consisted of a series of cables that were strung across the deck, designed to be snagged by hooks dangling from the landing aircraft. The Arrestor Gear helped bring planes to a stop before they plunged over the other end of the deck. In 1925, Captain Joseph T. Reeves took over command of the Langley. Even though he was a former battleship captain, the forward-thinking Reeves understood the potential of carrier-borne aircraft better than almost any other officer in the U.S. Navy.
What was special about Langley wasn't anything designed into her. What was special about Langley was what Captain Reeves put on. And that was the idea of arresting gear and a barrier forward. The idea that you could operate a lot of airplanes if, instead of putting them in a hangar every time they landed, you moved them to the front of the ship, protected them with a barrier. In that way, Reeves managed to quadruple the number of planes on the ship.
Captain Reeves also significantly increased the efficiency with which his aircraft were used by reducing the amount of time that was required between the launches of individual planes.
What Reeves really did as the skipper of the Langley was to fiddle around with the handling procedures of aircraft on his aircraft carrier to the extent where he was able to reduce launch intervals substantially and therefore get large numbers of airplanes in the air in a short time.
One major drawback to the Langley's flight operations was her slow speed. In order to leave the ground, a plane needs enough wind under its wings to lift into the air. On land, this is simply a matter of accelerating until the proper speed is reached. But on a carrier, the distance that a plane can travel to achieve its takeoff speed is restricted by the relatively short length of the flight deck. When a carrier turns toward the wind to launch its aircraft, the faster it goes, the more wind passes over the deck to help lift its planes into the air. But with a top speed of only 14 knots, The Langley was unable to generate much wind over her deck, which in turn limited the size and striking power of the planes she could operate. Since a carrier mounted little armament of its own, this was a crucial shortcoming. Despite this and other problems, on the Langley, a generation of naval aviators learned the skills and discipline that would sustain carrier operations through future challenges.
She is commissioned as our first carrier, the USS Langley. At once, she's nicknamed the Covered Wagon. She is fitted with arresting wires across the landing area to catch hooks mounted between the wheels of her airplanes. The planes have no brakes, and shoulder straps are yet to become standard cockpit equipment. In these days, Navy pilots with tongue-in-cheek define a successful landing as one which the pilot can walk away from. But scores of future air admirals will be among the thousands who will win their wings on the Navy's first carrier. It will become a proud boast for graying eagles to say, "I flew off the Langley." That pilot in trouble, Lieutenant Gerald Bogan, will one day, as a Rear Admiral, command a carrier task group through an important battle in World War II.
My tail hook, as it sometimes would happen, instead of engaging the arresting wire, rode one of these fore and aft wires, which caused the plane to slew to the left. There were several people, including Commodore Reeves, standing in the gallery near the two smokestacks on the port side, and I was afraid that my propeller would chew them up. So against all regulations, I gave her full throttle, and I did a very beautiful wing over the port side and into the drink. I was picked up by the plane guard.
Retired Rear Admiral Leslie Gary's was another Langley eaglet.
The qualification consisted of 3 successful landings, then takeoff. And once you'd made 3 of them, you were a carrier pilot. And of course, we built this thing up. Those of us who were carrier pilots, we affected to look down our nose at all other aviators because we were Langley pilots. And we built this all up to be quite a thing. And then later, when we got the other carriers, and it was our job to train and classify other carriers, then we had to break it all down again and convince everybody it was easy and safe and nothing to it. That Langley was really something.
And that's all, folks, for this episode on the aircraft carrier, the Langley. I hope you enjoyed learning about the ship, and hopefully you'll appreciate the ship a bit more when you see it in game. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you all on the high seas soon.